Hi, welcome to Cubs and Culture for February 1st for 2018. I've been doing this for about a month, and well, actually more than a month, and it's kind of awesome. I've never actually kept up with something like this. So whatever I'm doing, it's working. Yes, I promise I will eventually do something besides just have a one visual for the podcast to make this much more like a video as opposed to me just droning on. Anyway, today, I want to talk. This section I'm going to be setting up why I consider sort of Ian Happ the odd man out. And the next section is going to be me talking about Ian Happ as a player. Because to be perfectly blunt, if the Cubs are going to trade or trade a position player for pitching, I want Ian Happ. Like, I would prefer like the only one I could stand to part with is Ian Happ. And I'll get into why in the next section. So let me kind of explain something about the Cubs rebuild. And some of this gets a little bit into baseball history. So there is a draft in baseball. The draft isn't as important and as in like football or basketball because baseball, because it takes so long to develop players into major league talent, and with the farm system that there's a lot of unpredictability, there's injuries, etc. So while like people in the first 10 rounds, there's a lot of like first round drafts in baseball that just bust completely, like they never make the show. Probably the most famous example is this guy. His name is Steve Dalkowski. He's from the 1960s. He probably was the strong threw the ball the hardest in history. Yes, more than Chapman. He was also wild. So some of his minor league games are like he struck out 26, but he struck out 22, but walked 10. Walked 18. Because he couldn't for the life of him find the plate, and it took him a long time to get his act together. And sadly, about a week before he was going to make his first start actually in the major leagues, his elbow blew out, and Tommy John wasn't an option back then, and so he just never made the show. In any case, we have been getting better at this over time, but in any case, there's still, in terms of drafting, it's an art, not a science. And so the way in which large market teams used to unfairly, and by large market teams, I mean the Dodgers did this, the Red Sox did this, Epstein was sort of infamous for doing this, and the Yankees used to do this, is if you were willing to pay after the first, I think it was the first 2 rounds that you weren't allowed to do this, but after the first 2 rounds, players were free to sign with teams if the teams were willing to pay more bonus money than what the slot was allowed it. So if it was in the 3rd round and the amount for the slot was supposed to be $1 million, and let's say it's the Brewers wanted John Doe for $1 million in round 3 as sort of their first round pick. John Doe, if he didn't have to sign for the Brewers, as long as let's say he ended up signing with the Red Sox, as long as the Red Sox paid him more money and then a little bit of a fee to the Brewers in essence lost that draft slot. This was called overslotting. So Epstein with Boston really pursued this. Yankees did it, Dodgers did it, Giants did it. So because they could afford to do it. So if you really pursued this strategy aggressively, you could in essence have 3 drafts because you were basically paying other teams and players more for the slot pick. So you end up having 3 drafts. So it was a really quick way to generate major league talent because it was a way of throwing out a wide net and then letting the farm system whittle it down. That's mostly how Epstein built the 2007 Red Sox and the 2013 Red Sox, even though he wasn't officially the GM at that point. And he started doing this with the Red Sox right away. It's just that for the 2014, what he basically did was cobble together a whole bunch of veterans. The 2004 Red Sox are actually one of the oldest championship teams in history, which is probably why they were able to come back from 3-0 deficit in the pennant series. Anyway, overslotting was made against the rules correctly, because this is such a bullshit, like it's totally unfair to small market teams that they're in essence having their slots taken over by large big market teams, which is some sort of bullshit. But in any case, it was made illegal or against the rules right about the time Epstein became the president of operations for the Cubs. He's in essence the GM, even though that's not his official title. Hoyer's the actual GM. But in any case, so they pursued a tanking strategy, which is basically, and they had to do this for 3-4 years, where they basically got rid of all the really good players, or even players that were somewhat decent at the major league level. So they ended up losing more, so they got higher draft picks. And so this is how, because the way in which Epstein and Hoyer thought about this is they needed 4 impact players, and they generated most of this by draft. So the 4 impact players they got, and it's sort of neat, is it's sort of the order of the batting during the Game 7 of the World Series, who are Amora, Schwarber, Bryant, and then they traded for Rizzo. So 3 of the 4 were drafted through their tanking mechanism. Now, of course, the other team that really, like a third of the teams have now started pursuing this strategy, which is one of the reasons why the free market for free agents is stalled. Anyway, so the other team that really pursued this was the Astros, where they also went through 3 or 4 years of really shitty baseball. Astros lost 100 games 3 years in a row. One in their opening days starter payrolls was like $28 million or something, and this was to generate draft picks. So very similar, and this is sort of that. The major sort of difference between the Cubs and the Astros rebuild is, if you look at predictive models in terms of offensive capacities for position players, it's a lot easier to take high school information and from information about high school position players and project that out to major league. It has something to do with sample size. There's just, because you only pitch every 5 days, but high school samples are just larger. And then also, since so much of the and there's just so many more position players than there are pitchers, that they're just easier to project. So the Cubs, up until I believe it was 2016 was when they switched. They basically did not draft pitchers. They just drafted position players. And then they traded for or signed at the major league level. They traded for at the minor league level. They only traded for, but at the major league level, they also signed free agents, i.e., John Lester. And then the other thing is they went after reclamation projects, like Jake Arrieta. Okay, the Astros, on the other hand, they did draft position players like George Springer, but then they also would take reasonable gambles on pitchers. So like Lance McCullers Jr., who I actually really like as a pitcher, because he because of his curveball. Basically, he doesn't actually warm up with it, but it's so good that he finished the Game 7 of the pennant against the series against the Yankees with 28 in a row. Anyway, so they would trade for they drafted pitchers. Or another sort of example of this is Giles, who was their nominal closer. He was traded for, but it was just a 1-to-1 pitcher swap because they actually drafted a pitcher that didn't work out really. So that sort of the thing. So like I really appreciate the Cubs rebuild because I'm a fan, obviously. And I like how Epstein does it. I'm also really sort of like how the Astros did it, and I kind of feel a kindred spirit because they went through the 100 game loss 3 times in a row. In any case, the Astros don't quite have this problem because in the way in which their farm system has never been positional player heavy. The Cubs are, and it's going to be a year or two. So probably in 2019, you're not going to have this problem where pitching is such a desperate need because the farm system is utterly depleted on that. And so that's why we have this glut of positional players at the major league level that we might have to trade for pitching, is because they made the decision years ago, because position players are so more reliable for projection, that they would draft basically position players, and where they didn't have to do that. So it's sort of a deep decision that they made, which sort of threatens the major league team. And I'm just pointing out, Astros went through a very similar process, and I kind of like how they did it better because it seemed riskier but also safer, because you're taking small risk as opposed to a big risk, because their risk was risking individual pitchers not working, whereas this strategy that Epstein followed risked the entire system not collapsing because pitching wasn't a priority. Anyway, I'll see you in a bit about Ian Happ. See you.